Hello, my name's Martin Askew, and I'm Jamie Mclean's cousin. But Lenny Mclean, I always considered my big uncle. Really, he was always like the head of our family. Him and Bobby Warren.
Let's start from the beginning. What can you tell us about the childhood of Lenny Mclean in the East End?
Well, I know that Lenny had a very hard childhood, and Jimmy, his stepfather, was quite a brutal man by all accounts. I know that Lenny also looked up to a very famous governor of a manor or villain years ago called Jimmy Spinks, who was Lenny's uncle. Who they say actually that Graham Greene took some of that story and made it into a very famous book called Brighton Rock, which then became a very famous film. But Lenny looked up to Jimmy Spinks, who was very famous in Hoxton in the East End. So these were Lenny's role models, you see. Very tough living, hard men. And when I think about the East End that Lenny comes from, it was a post-war, almost I'd say like a place like Baghdad, London. You know, it was a post-war, very brutal part of Europe, London at that particular time, especially the East End. So it wasn't a very nice place for someone who was being brutalised by a stepfather. Lenny lost his father, in our family, lost his father early on to TB, and he had a lot of aunts. He had a lot of very strong women around him. My nan, he was always in and out of my nan's flat, and he was very close with my uncle Johnny Wall, who became quite a famous boxer. But Lenny to me was always a very funny, believe it or not, a very cuddly, a very loving man around children, who just seemed like, you know, he was a protector, and he was just larger than life type figure. You know, the room would light up when Lenny came in. You know, he was always doing silly little practical jokes, and you know, he once owned a sweet shop in Hoxton years ago, and he used to, the kids would come in for sweets, and he'd take their money, and then he'd flick the coin up and spin the coin up and say heads or tails, and whoever wins, you know, can have it. And they'd say heads, and he'd look at the tail, he wouldn't let them look at it, and he'd say no, tails, and he'd take the money.
Jimmy Spinks back then was the original governor, the old school governor. What did it mean to be the governor? What did it mean to be tough in 50s, 60s, 70s Hoxton?
I think being tough back then was a way to sort of, you know, gain that little bit of, it was a respectful thing to be tough, but you know, to be tough back in the 50s and 60s meant that you were someone. And if you wasn't tough, you was stepped on in the East End. You know, even in my generation, even in the late 70s and the early 80s, you had to fight, and unfortunately, you just literally had to fight out on the streets. It was quite brutal. Yeah, you've got to remember that my uncle Johnny Wall, I mean, he was a man who was Southern Area champion, who Angelo Dundee came in, see him as one of the best prospects. You're talking about Muhammad Ali's manager, come in for my Uncle John, but he never went to America. Someone else went to America, a guy named Billy Williams, who was quite famous. So he was training Lenny, and he was giving him a lot of the professional aspects of boxing, and Lenny became like a pro. He had like, I'd say, a fast track to becoming a pro boxer. So you can only imagine what he would have been like if you'd have got him when he was 7. Like you do in the East End, you go boxing when you're 5, 6, 7, all the way through the ranks. But Lenny never did. He just had that pure, natural toughness, that aggression. So it wasn't his destiny. But in the third fight, you see traits of a very, very skillful boxer who was becoming a boxer, and he'd only had a few fights by that time.
And what?
It's because, you know, from being a brawler and being a street fighter, you know, the ranks are always very contained and very tight, and everything's close and everything's meaningful. When they throw punches, they're not wasting punches, they're thinking. And that's what you see if you watch the progression of those fights. I don't know the amount of footage, but you know, but he did have that rage, have that sheer, that a lot of fighters have to contain. But then he just, you know, he had that rage as well.
I remember a couple of years ago you told me that a big part of it with Johnny Wall's training was the legs. Is that true?
Yeah, I think
leg work?
I think the footwork, and the way he used the kid, and also the road work as well. You know, I mean, they'd stop and have a roll up. That was the 70s, 80s style training. But the road work was, you know, Hampstead Heath. They'd hit the roads. They'd train proper, like, you know, 7, 13 runs, doing the boxers run on Hampstead. You know, and I was a kid, and I was privy to that. I used to go running with them. And they was training serious, you know.
Was there a scrapyard or
there was a scrapyard. I think it was down near Roman Road, and they used to train in the scrapyard. I never went to the scrapyard, but I know they used to train there. And those old school methods of training where it's all sort of minimalist, it's what helps a fighter. If someone's in that environment. Nowadays you walk in a gym, they're all sort of plush. You know, people putting on hand cream. I mean, these were men. They was like, you know, there was a dying breed. This was the old dying breed of warrior that no longer exists, you know.
Can you tell us briefly the kind of stuff like carrying minis, dragging trucks,
yeah,
training tyres?
Yeah, these are the sort of things. I can remember Lenny getting me on his back and doing 500 press-ups, you know, and I was a kid. To me it was fun. And then ripping his top off and showing us his muscles. And you know, when I look at these people now, are all on steroids and they're all ripped to pieces. The men even back then, their physiques were different. They had a layer of fat. They wasn't as sort of toned up, but they was tough. They were strong. He had brute strength. You know, like he could pick up a mini. You know, I think once there was 4 of them all going to a training session at Freddie Hill's gym, and someone had a little bit of road rage, and they was in a small mini, and all 4 of them got out. You know, Lenny, my Uncle Sean, and they didn't stop getting out on the poor little fella in a capri. You know, but they wasn't. You know, they was powerful men who mixed it up with powerful men. They didn't just go and learn martial arts or pump weights to go and brutalise anyone in the street, you know. There was honour, much, much more back then. But obviously things happened and liberties got took as well. It wasn't all sort of, the world wasn't rose-tinted spectacle.